early October 2025, Russia's financial markets convulsed again as citizens emptied their accounts at unprecedented speed, echoing the 1998 crash that once left the Kremlin pleading for international aid. How did a nation once boasting record oil revenues descend into another panic almost overnight? Could this be the moment when internal distrust finally topples Putin's carefully staged illusion of stability? According to new data released by Russia's central bank and corroborated by Reuters, withdrawals in the first 20 days of October reached nearly 180 billion rubles, matching the pace of summer's record exodus. The exodus comes despite the central bank's 17% interest rate, one of the highest among G20 economies. That figure alone tells you everything, a senior European economist told The Guardian. If people are pulling their savings even with double-digit returns, it means they no longer believe in tomorrow. This is where the domino effect analysis becomes crucial. The first domino public fear was triggered not by Western sanctions, but by internal decay. When ordinary depositors withdrew their funds, small banks faced liquidity shortages, forcing them to sell government bonds at a loss. That in turn weakened state finances, compelling the Kremlin to print more money to plug gaps. Inflation accelerated, eroding real incomes, and trust collapsed further, a loop feeding itself with each passing week. At the same time, President Donald Trump's administration in Washington has publicly reaffirmed that no additional U.S. financial relief would be extended to Moscow, a sharp contrast to the 1990s IMF coordination. The message from the White House was blunt. Russia's crisis is self-inflicted. Without Western credit lines, Putin has resorted to domestic coercion, blocking capital flows, freezing foreign currency transactions, and ordering banks to fund defense-linked industries regardless of solvency. That leads directly to the opportunity cost perspective. Every ruble allocated to propping up a failing steel combine or subsidizing drone production is a ruble not used to stabilize consumer markets or repair social programs. The Kremlin's choice to sustain its war economy thus robs the civilian sector of oxygen. As Deutsche Welle reported last week, fuel shortages now average 20% below pre-war supply levels, crippling transportation in provincial Russia. Public frustration is swelling. They tax us to death, then tell us to save, patriotically complained one shopkeeper interviewed by BBC News Europe. It's the same paradox haunting the regime. People cannot both trust and fear their state. The strategic contrast perspective exposes that paradox vividly. Putin preaches sovereignty and economic independence, while his policies tighten internal dependence on a shrinking elite circle. The Kremlin's vision of a fortress Russia stands in direct contradiction to its reality, a fortress whose defenders are emptying their own treasury chests. For now, panic hasn't yet turned into chaos. But analysts note eerie similarities with Argentina's 2001 bank freeze, long lines outside ATMs, police guards outside currency exchanges, and frantic buying of hard assets like gold and US dollars through gray markets. The question haunting Moscow's technocrats is not whether the system can be saved, but how long the illusion can last before the next domino crashes into the banking core itself. Meanwhile, as public trust continues to evaporate, the Kremlin's new capital restrictions threaten to deepen what economists already call the Great Withdrawal. What happens when those same controls collide with a society that's rapidly losing digital and financial freedom? By mid-October 2025, Moscow's financial authorities had entered full crisis management mode. Central Bank Governor Elvira Nabiullina appeared on state television pleading for patriotic calm, yet her tone betrayed the anxiety behind the Kremlin's facade. Can a government that confiscates wealth truly convince its citizens to keep faith in ruble notes? Official figures show that Russian banks processed over 216 billion rubles in cash withdrawals in June alone, followed by nearly the same amount in July. The pattern reveals what Reuters described as a controlled stampede. Even after the key rate rose from 20 to 17%, depositors kept fleeing a statistical impossibility in a healthy economy. The Russian system is not illiquid, an IMF analyst told Al Jazeera Economy. It is psychologically bankrupt. Here, the domino effect analysis deepens. The first wave of withdrawals forced mid-tier lenders to liquidate government bonds. That dumped pressure on the ruble, which slid nearly 9% in 2 weeks, igniting import inflation. Rising prices eroded savings, prompting another wave of panic withdrawals, a perfect circular collapse. Each bank run sparked fresh controls, and each control triggered new fear. The Kremlin's response, capital controls and gold export bans, only accelerated the exodus. In early October, Russia limited private gold exports to 100 grams per person, roughly $15,000 in value. For a nation whose elites hedge wealth through bullion, the signal was unmistakable: the vault doors are closing. At the same time, the Duma empowered Putin to criminalize foreign currency transactions, effectively outlawing ruble-to-dollar conversion. Western economists at the Financial Times called it the formal rebirth of the Iron Curtain via spreadsheet. The opportunity cost perspective exposes the burden of these emergency decrees. Every restriction, meant to protect reserves, sacrifices future growth. Small exporters cannot import machinery. Students abroad cannot access tuition funds, and tourism evaporates. Moscow's bid to seal leaks in its financial system now drains lifeblood from legitimate commerce. A DW report notes that small business activity has fallen below pandemic levels, with the RSBI index dipping under 50 points, the benchmark of contraction. Meanwhile, NATO-aligned analysts see this inward spiral as strategically revealing. A senior advisor at the U.S. Treasury told Defense News that Russia's internal lockdown may prove more effective than sanctions. It isolates capital, talent, and innovation all at once. The Western Bloc interprets the crisis not merely as financial contagion, but as a self-inflicted strategic restraint. Moscow can fund tanks, or trust not both. The strategic contrast perspective thus emerges sharply. Putin proclaims economic sovereignty while binding his nation to rigid dependency on administrative decrees. Each new ban meant to assert control only confirms how little control remains. Inside Russia, the social temperature is rising. Citizens queue outside ATMs, some carrying backpacks to stuff with cash. Telegram channels warn of deposit freezes, though state media brands them fake. When everyone repeats the same lie, even silence becomes dangerous, one Moscow accountant whispered to BBC World Service. Economists agree that trust once broken can't be legislated back. The longer people clutch rubles under mattresses, the less liquidity circulates, amplifying the freeze. And as local markets stall, the war economy, already dependent on forced loans, faces new paralysis. Yet even as the Kremlin struggles to control panic on the ground, a different storm is brewing in cyberspace, where the battle for financial survival meets Putin's tightening digital iron grip. What happens when fear of bank collapse collides with fear of online surveillance? In late October 2025, the Russian internet slowed to a crawl just as the banking panic peaked. Authorities blamed Ukrainian drones allegedly using local networks for targeting coordinates. But digital analysts from BBC Tech Europe and DW Digital reached a different conclusion. The blackout was political. Could Moscow's war on connectivity become the final spark that burns away what little economic trust remains? When the Kremlin throttled access to Telegram, WhatsApp, and Western banking APIs, transactions stalled nationwide. ATMs failed intermittently. Mobile banking apps crashed for hours. A Moscow-based fintech engineer told Reuters, "Without stable internet, clearing systems can't verify transfers." We're back to the 1990s Q's cash chaos. From the domino effect perspective, that disruption cascaded far beyond data cables. As small shops and taxi firms reverted to cash-only trade deposits shrank further. Electronic payment processors deprived of transaction fees cut staff. Their layoffs pushed more households into debt default. Each disconnected node, be it an app, an account, or a delivery firm, triggered failures down the supply chain. Within days, consumer confidence collapsed, like a network under overload. At the heart of this chaos sits a new state application, Max promoted as a secure alternative to Western messengers. But cybersecurity researchers from the Guardian Tech Review found direct data routing to government servers in Kazan. It's not about protection, one Western analyst said. It's about control. The strategic contrast perspective becomes unavoidable. Putin promises to defend citizens from foreign surveillance, yet installs a domestic panopticon that terrifies his own population into silence. Fear breeds flight from digital wallets, from banks, from the system itself. Russians began hoarding physical rubles, stacking notes in safes and cupboards. Economists call it the cash retreat. With every withdrawal, liquidity drains from productive sectors, the same sectors financing the defense industry. Here, the opportunity cost perspective surfaces. Each ruble hoarded by a citizen is a ruble the state cannot mobilize for war production or debt repayment. Western experts warn that digital isolation may cripple Russia's war logistics more than sanctions. Payment lags disrupt supply orders for ammunition and fuel, a NATO economic analyst told Defense News. If trucks can't process invoices, shells don't move. In that sense, the Kremlin's control obsession creates the very vulnerability it fears: a supply chain strangled by its own censorship. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump's administration publicly stated that Washington will not interfere in Russia's internal financial failures, while European regulators quietly track spillover risks to global payment systems. For NATO planners, the Meltdown provides intelligence. Each new digital restriction exposes another weak point in Russia's command economy. Still, ordinary Russians feel the pain first. "I couldn't pay my utility bill for 2 weeks," one St. Petersburg teacher told Al Jazeera English. "They tell us to be calm, but the internet is gone, our money is gone. What else can we lose?" Her question resonates across the Federation. As Putin tightens his grip online, he unravels the very networks sustaining commerce. And if citizens no longer trust the web, the banks, or the state, where will they turn when wages vanish and prices climb again? Meanwhile, with financial arteries clogging, the Kremlin's next move would reveal just how far it's willing to go to sustain the illusion of solvency by forcing banks deeper into debt to feed the war economy. By early November 2025, the Kremlin had shifted from damage control to forced mobilization of capital. State media called it financial patriotism, but Western analysts described it as fiscal conscription. Could Russia's banking sector survive being drafted into a war it never volunteered for? Putin's economic decree, signed the first week of November, ordered commercial banks to extend low-interest strategic loans to defense contractors and heavy industry firms, even those already insolvent. Reuters confirmed that several regional banks were compelled to refinance arms supply companies at negative real yields, effectively turning them into subsidized state branches. "This is not banking," remarked a former Russian finance official interviewed by Al Jazeera Business. "It's triage with rubles instead of bandages." From the domino effect perspective, each of these coerced loans becomes a falling tile in an accelerating chain. A weapons plant loan defaults. The bank loses liquidity. The central bank prints money to replace it. Inflation rises, and the ruble weakens further, forcing yet another bailout. In just 6 weeks, Russia's monetary base expanded by nearly 8%, the steepest monthly jump since 2014. DW Finance reported that consumer inflation is now approaching 18%, despite price caps on fuel and staples. The opportunity cost perspective highlights what Moscow must now forfeit to sustain this cycle. By channeling credit into failing arms manufacturers, the Kremlin deprives small enterprises of financing. IMF data show lending to SMEs down 22% year-on-year. Shops close, logistics firms idle trucks for lack of spare parts, and regional governments slash healthcare budgets to cover payroll arrears. Every ruble that props up a tank factory represents a hospital ward left unfunded. Meanwhile, Western observers see a wider strategic picture. NATO economists interpret the crisis as evidence that Putin's war economy is eating itself alive. The more he centralizes finance, the less adaptive his production base becomes, said a senior analyst at Defense News Europe. He can print rubles, but not credibility. The U.S. Treasury's October brief under President Trump described Russia's banking mandates as self-imposed sanctions, forecasting that sustained credit coercion will collapse private sector confidence before 2026. This sets up a strategic contrast perspective that borders on tragic irony. The Kremlin's dream of autarky demands the very dependence it despises. To fund independence from the West, it chains its own banks to the state, replicating Soviet-era distortions that once ended in bankruptcy. Across Russia, industrial indicators confirm the cost. Demand for steel has fallen 15% since January. Mining output stagnates, and rail freight volumes are at their lowest since the pandemic. The dominoes extend even into households, job losses, wage cuts, and shrinking consumer spending. "We can't buy what we build," lamented a factory worker in Yekaterinburg, quoted by BBC Newsworld. Inside, the Kremlin officials privately admit they have few options left. Foreign reserves remain largely frozen abroad, and attempts to issue domestic war bonds have flopped. Citizens no longer trust promises of repayment. Economists whisper that a banking collapse could arrive in quarters, not years. Yet the leadership presses on, convinced that financial control equals stability. But history rarely obeys decrees. As one Western strategist noted, "When you weaponize your banks, you risk shooting your own economy." Still, Putin's immediate challenge lies beyond balance sheets. As elites witness the state seizing assets and jailing dissenting executives, loyalty is thinning among those who once financed his empire. What happens when the oligarchs themselves decide to flee and take the last of Russia's liquid wealth with them? By mid-November 2025, Russia's super-rich began quietly disappearing from Moscow's skyline. Private jets once crowding Vnukovo's hangars now depart at dawn for Dubai, Yerevan, or Almaty. Bloomberg confirmed that at least $7 billion in private assets left Russia in the first 2 weeks alone. But could this exodus of capital and confidence mark the real breaking point of Putin's financial fortress? The Kremlin has moved swiftly to trap what remains. A new decree criminalizes unauthorized foreign exchange, meaning any Russian converting rubles into dollars or euros faces prosecution. In parallel, the finance ministry restricted gold exports to 100 grams per person, barely worth $15,000. Western analysts see this as the birth of a new Iron Curtain. "It's a digital cage disguised as patriotism," said a senior economist at the Guardian business desk. From the domino effect perspective, each flight of capital further weakens the ruble, forcing higher interest rates that strangle domestic investment. Factories already starved of credit cannot modernize. Layoffs increase, reducing tax income and pushing regions deeper into debt. As the upper class escapes, the fiscal burden shifts downward onto workers and pensioners. Russia is cannibalizing its middle class to fund oligarchic survival, remarked an analyst for Reuters Markets. The opportunity cost perspective reveals a grim irony. Every ruble spent policing currency exchanges or seizing villas could have financed social welfare or stabilized wages. Instead, Putin's regime devotes manpower to chasing fugitives and confiscating accounts. DW Economy estimates enforcement operations now consume 1.2% of GDP annually, a drain equal to Russia's education budget. The price of control is opportunity itself. Meanwhile, the strategic contrast perspective underscores Putin's contradiction. He promises national strength, yet erodes the very capital that could sustain it. For my friends, everything. For my enemies, the law, quipped one European diplomat, echoing a Russian proverb circulating on Telegram. By weaponizing legality, the Kremlin signals to investors, foreign and domestic, that contracts mean nothing. Western financial institutions observe closely. NATO's Economic Analysis Board noted that the oligarch flight mirrors Cold War-era patterning as the elite flee institutional stability decays. Washington, under President Trump, has quietly expanded sanctions coordination with London and Brussels, ensuring that fugitive assets can be traced even in neutral jurisdictions. Every transaction tells a story, said a U.S. Treasury official to Defense News. And the story we're seeing is that Moscow's elite no longer believe in Moscow. Back home, Russians feel the fallout through swelling taxes and vanishing subsidies. The Kremlin's need for liquidity means excise duties on alcohol and utilities are soaring. I used to pay 250 rubles for water, a St. Petersburg resident told Al Jazeera English. Now it's 400 and they still call it patriotic pricing. Such stories multiply daily across the provinces. Still, the state's most perilous gamble isn't economic, it's psychological. The more citizens witness confiscations, the faster they hide what little they have. As fear becomes policy, governance morphs into survival management. Yet in this spiral, one question looms larger than all others. If even Russia's billionaires are racing for the exits, what remains for the ordinary citizen trapped behind Putin's financial walls? Meanwhile, as elites vanish and savings evaporate, the social fabric itself begins to fray. The next chapter of Russia's crisis isn't about money. It's about morale, survival, and a nation losing faith in its own future. By late November 2025, the mood across Russia had turned unmistakably grim. What began as a banking panic had evolved into a social unraveling. Hospitals faced medicine shortages, teachers went unpaid, and regional governments quietly suspended welfare programs. In Belgorod, local officials confirmed to Reuters that maternal stipends for young mothers had been postponed indefinitely. The question haunting many was no longer whether the ruble would recover, but whether everyday life could. Beer prices soared to all-time highs after Moscow imposed new excise taxes, and grocery inflation officially listed at 18%. Though independent estimates run higher, has forced families to skip meals. From an opportunity cost perspective, every new ruble taxed for the war effort deprives citizens of basic needs. As BBC News Europe noted, the Kremlin has replaced subsidies with slogans. A silent epidemic reflects the toll. Russia's antidepressant sales have nearly tripled since 2022, according to Al Jazeera Health Monitor. Pharmacies report shortages of imported medication due to currency restrictions. The domino effect analysis plays out painfully here. Inflation leads to poverty, poverty to despair, despair to social withdrawal, and with each step, productivity collapses further, tightening the economic noose. Inside government circles, desperation shows. Regional governors plead for budget relief, but Moscow's coffers are drained. The state is now eating its own periphery, one economist told DW Business. That periphery includes schools, hospitals, and civil infrastructure, all now in decay as funds are redirected to sustain a war that yields diminishing returns. From a strategic contrast perspective, the contradiction is stark. Putin's rhetoric of revival contrasts sharply with an economy that resembles controlled demolition. His drive to restore greatness has reduced living standards to post-Soviet lows. And yet official propaganda insists Russia stands stronger than ever, a narrative even loyal citizens now greet with silent disbelief. Western analysts believe this internal decay has geopolitical resonance. Moscow's economic collapse is NATO's quietest victory, said a Brussels-based defense economist to Defense News. The Kremlin can't finance both a foreign war and domestic stability indefinitely. In Washington, President Donald Trump's administration has maintained that the U.S. will not intervene, but will let market forces deliver accountability. For the West, containment no longer requires confrontation. The Kremlin is containing itself. Still, amid the gloom, small signs of quiet defiance appear. Independent teachers' unions in Novosibirsk and Tomsk have begun coordinating petitions demanding back pay. Shopkeepers trade foreign currency informally, despite the risk of prison. These acts may seem trivial, but they reveal what Putin's financial decrees cannot suppress: survival instinct. At street level, despair coexists with resilience. We have seen worse, muttered an elderly Muscovite to The Guardian, but never with so little hope. That sentiment captures the new Russian reality: fear without faith, control without confidence. Meanwhile, the Kremlin's silence grows louder. With oligarchs gone, banks bleeding, and citizens numbed, even loyal propagandists struggle to spin triumph from collapse. Yet one chilling question remains: when the money ends and the morale breaks, what holds a nation together?